continuing this attribution theme, I'm actually delighted to welcome back Cindy Davis of Disney ABC Television Group and Craig Macdonald of Accenture. And they're following up on a study they presented at last year's summit on the next phase of their research on multi-platform TV attribution. So take it away. Your clicker's right here.
Great. That looks like the last slide, unless you doubled it up.
Is that the first slide or the last slide?
That's the last one.
That looks like the last slide. While they're doing that, good afternoon. Craig and I are excited to be back here, share a little bit with you about a second phase of work that we've done around attribution, which seems to be the topic du jour, which we're excited about. For those of you, show of hands, how many people were here for the CIMM meeting last year? Okay. If you were, then you heard us talk about the first phase of work that we did from an attribution standpoint together, which really focused on the impact of multi-platform television on ROI. And since everybody didn't raise their hand, we thought a good way to start, the very first thing, would be to have Craig give you a quick recap of what that work entailed and how we did it and the major key finding that came out of it. And that'll sort of create a foundation for what we're going to talk about for the rest of the time today.
Yeah, and I'll go through this briefly because, again, many of you were here a year ago. The reason Accenture did this study is because, like the previous presentation, we do a lot of media mix modeling on a global basis. But here in the United States, we have a data sample where, in the case of this study, we used 2013 to 2015 media analytics from our clients. We tracked in that study about $15 billion worth of media spend on an annualized basis. And what's most important, though, is when we do econometrics modeling, we get the sales that are generated from that media money, so we could do the analytic study. What we were trying to do in this study was look at channel-level attribution performance and figure out, well, what's the relative value of each of those individual channels, out-of-home, radio, obviously TV, obviously digital, in driving sales. A couple of the key things we were trying to accomplish and a couple of our key findings. One, we changed the definition of how we define TV into this concept called multi-platform TV, because we were trying to pick up the concept of TV viewability and the advertisement that's embedded within TV viewability for premium long-form video shown on any platform versus short-form video. Think the cat video, the pre-roll that's on the cat video on YouTube, et cetera, right? A couple of the key findings that we found. One was that from a pure attribution standpoint, what we were doing was comparing the absolute performance of a channel to its marginal performance as a channel, trying to get that attribution concept. And the highlight was that when we looked at multi-platform TV ROI, it was essentially undercounted by about 10% in the analysis that we were doing, and digital was overcounted by 18%. There's a couple of quick ramifications that I just want to mention of that. Looking at that, we saw that, frankly, digital was oversubscribed by about 5 to 7%, depending on the vertical in our survey, largely because of this problem, ability to use marginal attribution as a way to measure the actual performance or attributed performance of a channel. And the best way to make, for example, search perform better was there was a bunch of collinearity between search and TV. As TV spend went up, search value went up. And those things work very much in concert with each other. The last point I'll make is that I think we teased out a concept, which is that not all impressions are created equal. The content itself, or the rich media format of TV, has an actual long-lasting impact. In the case of our study, because we had a 3-year sample, we were able to see that the value of a TV ad, only about 50% of a quarter's worth of spending on TV was recognized within the first 12 months. The other 50% was in the subsequent 24 months, versus most of the digital channels we looked at where almost all the value is subsumed within the quarter in which the expenditures are made.
Great. So we got a lot of good learnings. To summarize that entire study in one slide, and what Craig just said is hard, but we had a lot of good learnings. But we still had questions, right? So armed with those learnings, we commissioned Accenture to do another very robust piece of work. In fact, probably even more robust than the first, right, Craig? Yeah. We nearly doubled the amount of marketing spend we were looking at. We looked at $25 billion in media spend across 26 clients, across 6 different industries. And as Craig said, similar to what we did in the first phase of the study, we were able to have, in addition to that, 3 years of actual sales results, right, to connect. We looked at a host of different variables, right, because what we were trying to do here was identify really what the key drivers of multi-platform television ROI were, right? The first phase talked about the impact of multi-platform TV from an ROI standpoint. This was really digging in to try to find out what those key drivers were. So we looked at a host of different variables. We looked, of course, at things like Nielsen ratings. We also looked with Nielsen Social at social metrics, and we used a lot of good information from Magid to look at content engagement and intentionality and attention. And so a host of variables that we were able to take a look at. And again, that goal was really be able to identify the things about the content that contribute most to what our advertisers are trying to drive, which is sales. So what I'd love to do now is let Accenture do what they do best, right? And tell you about the key findings that they had, but let me just quickly frame those for you into 3 areas. When we had finished all of the work and identified the 3 big drivers, they were audience size, consumers' commitment to content, which we'll talk to you a little bit about, and consumers' perception and evaluation of that content. Not our perception, consumers' perceptions of the content. So Craig, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So there's a fundamental assumption that actually Joe had mentioned this before in the panel 2 ago, which is that attention leads to attribution. I mean, that's the fundamental thing we're trying to test here. And as Cindy said, we took 3 years worth of programming schedules, every single program for 26 different advertisers, and we saw every single show that they were advertising in, right? And we knew what the ratings were on those shows, and we knew what the amount that was spent on those shows. We looked across all networks, so this wasn't just Disney, ABC, this was across all networks, right? And so the first thing that I want to, let me grab that real quick. First thing I want to talk about is that because we had such topography in the data, like Cindy said, we were trying to test a couple of key things. The first thing we looked at was audience size. So looking across rating, right, we basically were able to compare, was the rating increases on a show, what happens to the cost of getting that rating point? Joe talked about this as well. He was talking about the increased cost per rating. And then what happens to the ROI? Because that's actually the thing that the advertisers are ultimately trying to drive. And the theory is that as the rating goes up, there's a almost, I would say, social impact of the communities that develop around the shows. You can see here in the graphic, the cost multiple goes for the lowest rated programs from 0.4 up to 0.12. So basically, a high rated show is about 3 times the expense of a low rated show. We just put everything in big buckets just to kind of like take out the noise and get to the key findings. But the ROI is almost 7 to 8x what the on a high-rated show than on a low-rated show. We didn't get deeply into the causality of this, but I'll get into some of the indicators that we had in a second. But the theory is that a high-rated show is just creating a conversation in the society. It's creating a cultural event that feeds on itself and actually allows the advertisers that are embedded within those shows to benefit from that, I guess, that social gestalt. Now, digging into that a little bit, we also layered in some other data points. I'll start on the right-hand side, right? So again, we looked at a series of different shows, and we normalized all the shows for rating, basically, right? And then we looked at the engagement from using Nielsen social media data, which is essentially what's the Twitter activity within a 2-hour window of the airing of the show, and then compared that to the ROI. So think about 2 different shows. One has a very high rating, one has a very low rating. We normalized the rating out of that, though. And then what we were able to see was one that had a high social media engagement. What happened to the ROI? Well, it was about 2x what a show that has a low social media engagement has. So social media engagement on the show itself has a big impact on the ability of that show to deliver ROI for the advertisers that are embedded within those shows. Then Magid also had a survey that we layered on top of the program level information, which looks at each of the programs and says, do consumers say that they have the intention to continue to invest their time in that show as well? And what's the ramification of that for the advertisers? Again, on this particular survey, a show that showed high intentionality was delivering a 2x ROI for the advertisers embedded in that show versus one that had a low intentionality. This last area, though, I think is the most fascinating. Magid also does a survey which is essentially an indicator of the engagement that the consumers have with the content itself on a whole series of different factors. They call it emotional DNA. There's 7 or 8 factors, is it? Eight factors. Right, Mike? But there's 8 different factors in there. And what we did is we looked at each of the shows and said, well, what's the variability in the ROI based off of how the consumers that are evaluating the content of the show on each of these 8 different dimensions, and do those dimensions then drive differential ROI? And this is really a commentary on if consumers are engaging with various emotional aspects of a show, do they then engage in a different way with the advertisements that are shown on that show, and then do they buy the goods, and does that show up as ROI for the advertiser? And we saw it in Technicolor. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of variability in this data. I will give you a couple of examples, though, just at the highest level. Shows that had a high emotional DNA from the Magid study were delivering a 1.7x ROI over those that had a low engagement from the standpoint of the survey itself. Cindy's going to talk a little bit more detail, though, about how this got translated out into some of the key dimensions themselves.
Sure, thanks. This last area is one that we found particularly interesting, and it's, as Craig said, we used the Magid eDNA, sort of emotional DNA index here. And if you aren't familiar with that, Mike, raise your hand, right? Right, a shout out to you. You can buy me a drink later. But if you're not familiar about it, I'm sure he'll be around to share it with you a little bit. But we found it really interesting, and it's at its core, right? What we're showing here and what we're seeing here is that shows that have a stronger emotional signature deliver stronger ROI, right? Where we saw that direct connection between how customers feel about our shows, right? And the benefits that are attributed to the advertiser in terms of increased sales. There's 3 dimensions in particular out of the 8 where we saw significant correlation. Smarts, edge, and relatability, again, Mike can provide you details on what exactly those 3 of the 8 dimensions mean, but anywhere from 2.5 to 4.2x in terms of higher ROI. So we're spending a lot of time digging into this area. I think you heard it in several of the panelists talking about this emotional connection, this experience, this way to make a connection with our customers. And now we believe we have a very strong evidence that what we've all believed, I think, for a very long time is in fact proven out in the benefits from an ROI standpoint that can be earned by the advertiser that participates in that content. So a lot more work to do here, but we're super interested in digging in deeper because the findings we feel are very compelling. We've just started talking to our advertisers about the study, so it's fresh, and we're having some really good conversations. If you would like to know more about either the first study that we conducted last year that spoke to the benefits of multi-platform television, or this one, first place to go is abcallaccess.com, our website. There's video and infographics there for you. And if you're interested in seeing the full study, just feel free to reach out to me, cindy.davis@disney.com. And we'll make arrangements for someone to take you through the full study. We're really encouraged about, to what all of our panelists were talking about, the opportunity to really show what every advertiser is challenged, to really stand up and defend, which is, did that advertising in that show work, and it deliver ROI? I will tell you the truth, I had a little bit of a freak out deja vu moment when Lou was talking about being in that boardroom with the CFO, right, and seeing money move, right, from advertising to another area of the company. I have been there multiple times in my career and had what I can only call attribution envy, right, to other parts of the company who could directly show, right, that what they were doing was work and delivering financial benefit and delivering on KPIs for the company. So just to start, just scratching the surface. Let us know if you want to know more. We appreciate the time, and thanks very much if you will help me thanking our partners from Accenture.